Download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources at savantwealth.com/guides.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We certainly appreciate you joining us. My name is Jake Loescher, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar about making a difference in philanthropy within retirement. I'm a financial advisor here at Savant in our Rockford, Illinois location, and joining me today is fellow financial advisor Joel Cundick. Welcome, Joel. How are you?
Good, doing well out here, Jake. I'm with Savant's Vienna, Virginia office. So Jake and I have worked together for a long time, and we're looking forward to presenting you today. This is the time of year that charitable giving seems to come to everyone's mind more often than others. We're happy to help out whenever during the year that somebody has a charitable giving question, but we get a lot of them this time of year.
Agreed. Yeah, and we'll be, of course, addressing questions as part of this presentation. So to the extent you're participating in today's webinar and you have a question, feel free to go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and insert your question there. We'll certainly have time to actually address those as we continue forth. But moving ahead, just wanted to share the actual agenda of things we'll plan to discuss today. So these are the items that Joel and I will be focusing on, and we'll be going, of course, back and forth to make this as open and inviting as possible, starting with assessing, of course, financial resources and priorities. Moving on to actual giving vehicles that can be used to help make charitable giving possible, focusing on estate planning, and finally kind of honing in on a personalized philanthropic plan. And again, to my point before, we'll be going through questions and answers towards the end of today's program, and certainly look forward to sharing information with you here today. So getting us started on the financial resources and priorities section here, when you think about charitable giving, really it's interconnected. So lots of disciplines within financial planning, whether it's investments, estate planning, taxes, physical retirement planning, so being within retirement and calling upon your assets to produce income for you. All of these pieces are kind of interrelated, and charity, if you could visualize it, gets put squarely in the middle. You can't make decisions around charitable giving, whether you do it now or later in a big way or a small way, without considering, the various resources that are part of the overall plan. And with any good philanthropic plans we'll kind of continue to discuss today, you'll see how each one of these pieces are certainly part of the overall philosophy. For example, someone that wants to build and manage an investment allocation for their overall portfolio may be very conservative or be very aggressive depending on what charities are important to them. And if those gifts are stewarded now versus later, it can influence how aggressive someone might ultimately be. And with that same point in mind, thinking about the costs of the overall investment vehicles that you use and the tax properties of the actual investment vehicles that are used, all of that then kind of relates to, okay, which assets are best used to give to charity and how could that influence my overall income tax? So all of this, the resources, the things that are at your disposal are certainly part of this process today. And the charitable end of things or the philanthropic end of things are kind of connect all of these different pieces. But I think most importantly, and often what happens is, I would say sometimes you have average retirees that receive a lot of mail from different charities they may have donated to over a course of time, asking for $25 here or $50 there. And some folks, which is totally okay, will just write checks to different organizations, maybe 30, 40, 50 at a time, and just do that in response to letters received in more of a reactive approach. And what we really want to talk about today is kind of being proactive with starting to think about these things. And none of it starts without really identifying your personal priorities. At Savant, we talk a lot about getting to your ideal future. And ideal future is really the end goal and something always to be in pursuit of. But it starts with what's most important, because what's most important then identifies the actual specific goals you may select when building a plan and the actual strategies that are then used and executed on. And Joel's going to share, about a variety of different giving vehicles or strategies that can be used to help accomplish charitable giving. But we wanted to spend quite a bit of time thinking about underneath, the surface, right? What are those priorities that drive decision making? So, for example, on this screen, and certainly not going to read every question to you, thinking about what your goals are when you give. And we'll lead into this in a few more slides, but is your goal to make large impact, small impact for many organizations, a large impact for a few organizations? Thinking about what the goals are, but I think it's supported by some of these other elements of what your family dynamics are. For example, someone that is single or divorced or widowed will have significantly different resources at their disposal and use of those assets compared to somebody that may have a significant other or a spouse that they have to worry about caring for in the future. Similarly, if you have family of some sort, whether it's children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, that you also want to prioritize as part of an estate plan, well, how does that impact charitable giving and whether you prioritize that now or later? And I think one of the most important pieces on this slide is thinking about protecting yourself. Often we think about late in life what may ultimately happen. Perhaps some of you have gone through situations where you've guided parents or grandparents through a long-term care stay or a nursing event, which was significant in cost. Sometimes it's hard to really prioritize that now because it's an unknown. You're not sure how much it's going to cost or for how long it may last, but you have real life experience dealing with family members yourself. You also have to consider that as a priority while you're also considering charitable planning as part of your overall financial plan. So how these priorities ultimately align with most important to you, and then which goals support those priorities, and then which strategies are elected to support the goals which were built on these priorities, all kind of help lead you back to that ideal future.
Jake, one of the questions we ask when we sign on clients initially as we're trying to get to know each other is, hey, does it matter more for you that you live on your resources and that maybe there's a little left over, or does it matter that more to you that children or charity are more of a priority to the sacrifice potentially of your retirement? And I've had clients answer both ways. You know, there's no definitive right answer to what that is, but it is important to ask that question of yourself.
Absolutely. And we'll often hear people say things like, well, charity starts at home. You know, should I be charitably inclined towards, you know, actual not-for-profits, or should I help my family members as part of this? So to your point, Joel, that balancing act, you may have an idea of what that should mean today, but it doesn't mean it can't change. Doesn't mean it can't become larger or more impactful in one direction or the other at any point in time. But it's definitely a point of kind of ongoing conversation, because we always have to continue to reassess those priorities, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So specific to the retirement planning side, there's a lot on this screen, but so much of this comes down to whether you will be okay. So some of the things I mentioned on the priority side, not only caring for yourself, managing your day-to-day expenses throughout retirement, thinking about current or longer-term healthcare expenses, going through kind of an approach to identify whether you will be okay first before determining what would be considered aspirational. So in some ways, we like to think about life as with finances in buckets. So if we could visualize for a moment, you have a bucket that is just defined for safety only, right? So this is the funds that are maybe 0 to 12 months worth of living expenses that you may have in the bank to make you feel good and have profound safety and peace of mind, knowing that whatever the investment markets may do with the bulk of your assets, as long as I have an established amount that makes me feel comfortable, that safety bucket is kind of the first thing and most important element to prioritize with your personal finances. The second one's more that lifestyle bucket. So that's really what we're kind of talking through here when we think about whether someone might have unneeded assets. So a lifestyle bucket is really something where you identify 12 months and beyond. Though not knowing exactly the answer to beyond, because everyone's life expectancy is, of course, going to be different. But as I'll mention in just a moment, there's a variety of tools you can use to identify how much should be in that lifestyle bucket, and ultimately how that money should be invested to support lifestyle, meaning your own day-to-day expenses, goals and priorities you have around trips you might want to take, or how you want to prioritize spending your own wealth. Obviously factoring in healthcare and long-term care in that process as well. But then the third bucket, after you figure out safety and lifestyle, if both of those are, let's say 80% of your assets are used for those two buckets and you have 20% left over, well, that's what we kind of build in what's called an aspirational bucket. So it's you have this third item, this third leg, where it might be considered unnecessary for your core lifestyle and safety, but could be used for other purposes. That's where, in some cases, a significant philanthropic opportunity might be available if it's important. But when we think about kind of the retirement planning process, and we go through this with individuals, and people often think about these things, there's a lot of rules of thumb around how you actually analyze someone's ability to maintain their lifetime income. A couple of those rules of thumb, of course, diversify, right? Don't have all your investment eggs in one basket, because certain areas of the investment world may perform significantly better than others, and you don't want to be wrong at the wrong time. So diversifying your assets. Of course, there's the element of riding out cycles, not knowing how the market's going to perform tomorrow or next month or next year, but knowing full well that the bear markets of 20% declines happen regularly. Every 3 to 5 years, we get a more significant downturn that we have to recover from. And being able to ride out those cycles comes back to identifying what the proper asset allocation strategy needs to be, so that you're comfortable emotionally, so that you won't, jump out of the boat into the ocean at the wrong time. But it also has enough return to otherwise support your long-term living expenses and some of those things I had mentioned in the previous slide. And one of the tools we have with that is we call a Monte Carlo simulation. Basically, it's a statistical probability analysis that looks at 1,000 different iterations of a future, not knowing what markets will return. And it attempts to quantify the number of those simulations that show you with at least $1 left at the end of your lifetime. Now, that may seem ridiculous if it's just $1 left at the end of your lifetime, but as planners, for us, that means you didn't run out of money. You didn't run out of resources. So a little meter on the right hand of the slide here kind of identifies, the actual probability of someone's plan. So 87% of those 1,000 scenarios showed, this particular individual or couple that, boy, you have enough money. You're not going to run out with a high likelihood of success over your lifetime based upon all the different assumptions we had built into the plan. And charitable aspects can be built into this. So if someone says, I give regularly 5 to 10 to 15,000 a year to different charities, and I want to be able to understand if I can continue to support that with my resources, this is where we use Monte Carlo simulation to kind of build in and identify whether you have enough for safety and lifestyle buckets, but also considering aspirational buckets as part of this process. And of course, we go through a lot of detailed analysis with this too, right, Joel?
Yeah, well, what's interesting about this is, there's calculators out there that will do this now online, right? There's plenty, and what I've found is that the outcome of the data depends a lot on the inputs, and there's a lot of inputs. I'll just give you a case. This is not the first time we've seen this movie. We've helped hundreds of families retire, and one of the things I've noticed in 20 years of helping families is that spending is not constant throughout retirement. So plugging in a spending number at age 65, growing it by inflation for the next 30 years is probably going to give you a different result and some more nuanced answers we can come up with if we are driving the questions, the proper questions to ask about the timing of spending and what's to be likely. And oftentimes in that situation, we end up in a scenario where somebody has a probability of success that's well above what they need. And that's where we can then introduce a discussion about planned giving, even to someone who was not even thinking of doing this until a later point.
I totally agree. In fact, on that meter, Joel, I often consider that blue section as a little bit of a planned failure, because although it would be like above our confidence zone for someone being able to retire in a typical circumstance and not have a substantial risk of running out of money, in the blue area, now, of course, engineers and folks really want to have 99% probability to never run out of money. But in that blue section, it's almost like left opportunity on the table, whether it's for your own personal resources, family giving, charitable giving. But I tend to agree that we have to drive these opportunities when in long-term discussion, revisiting the plan and not just setting and forgetting it.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody the other day who talked to me about having just received some funds via inheritance, and their comment was really fascinating to me. They said, I really wish that my parents would have spent this, because I'll do something with it, but wow, they worked really hard to accumulate this, and I kind of wish that they would have done other things with this money. That's the kind of stuff that we're trying to avoid in these kinds of scenarios.
That's a very frequent attitude. Usually the next generation isn't just waiting with open arms to receive a basket full of goods, right?
Yep.
So right. Having those conversations proactively with each member of the generations, just to make sure that those family priorities are also part of this planning process, is super important. So what I'd like you to do, if you're sitting in front of your computer and you're watching us today, is just get a pen and pencil and write these questions down, or take a picture, right? Grab your phone, take a picture of this slide. I know you'll ultimately get a copy of the slides later on through our recording of this presentation. But just these very basic questions on the front end are super helpful with helping just think about what charitable giving or an overall philanthropic lifestyle might look like. Because so much of this is influenced based upon what's happened during your lifetime. For example, when you were growing up, what did philanthropy look like for you and your family? For my family, it was a lot of more volunteering of time, as an example. So lots of board service, volunteer work, at soup kitchens, for example, as opposed to writing large checks and supporting large organizations. But that was how philanthropy influenced me, and so naturally, I'm very involved in the community. I like to be involved and give back, my time and talent, and occasionally, of course, treasure as well. But that was very influential for me. Joel, of these questions, which one resonates most with you?
Yeah, well, it's the sort of impact you want to have in the world, because the interesting thing to me is that there's so much need out there, and it can be overwhelming for somebody looking at, all right, whoa, what is it? And so what I really like about that idea of like what sort of impact you want to have is to just narrow your thinking toward a section of the many possibilities out there, and knowing that there will be enough and hopefully and to spare for the other organizations that are going to receive assistance, but you want to support the places that are going to have the most impact for you.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of reasons why people give, and several different considerations. In fact, Joel, one of the things you and I were talking about leading up to today was this aspect of generational beliefs. So generations are giving differently now. Thinking about young people compared to the older generations. Older generations are much more likely to gift in big ways, or be motivated to help and volunteer within their communities with their time. Whereas, of course, younger generations are sometimes very quick, small gifts that ultimately amount to a significant amount just through crowdfunding. So thinking about GoFundMe pages, you might have a quick 10, 15, or $20 contribution to an organization or a cause where you might have several 100,000 people giving all at the same time. So they might be very quick, a little bit more tactical, not necessarily as long-term or strategic. Whereas sometimes older generations tend to be more longer term and strategic with their giving. And both can have a place and a role. Neither are wrong or right. But it is interesting how kind of the generational beliefs are impacting the ways in which people give and why people give. A lot of that, more of that social influence seems to be more prevalent in giving kind of across the board. And with this, when we think about transactional versus transformational, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning of our chat here, there's no right or wrong way to give to charity, and it's ultimately comes down to what's most important to you. Transactional giving is more of the responding and reactive to charitable causes and wanting to, give money relative to things that are important at that moment in time. Transformational are the much more larger, prolonged, substantial gifts that you might have, an allegiance to one organization or another, and you give large ways every single year for a long period. And that can actually have a transformational impact on a not-for-profit. But again, both are good for different reasons. And I can tell you just from being a board member, both are appreciated. So in knowing that there's no, right or wrong answer with that, it just ends up being lots of different reasons why people give in different ways. But it all comes,
Jake,
I think, back to the values and priorities.
Sorry about that. That circles back to the question about what impact you want to have. And I have seen people kind of get paralyzed by this, right? Where it's kind of like, I want to give, and I just don't know what to give to. You can look at your own personal background, or your parents' background, or a mentor's background, people who are really important to you, and the ways that maybe you can impact. Like I've seen people who were involved in music fund things that will get instruments to children in need. I've seen people who's traveled giving money to organizations that are going to help children overseas, right? With basic needs. I've seen people involved in education who really get concentrated on, well, how can we leverage giving to make education opportunities more possible? So really look to like your background and what has been most interesting to you, to look at maybe where the place to start here if you're feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. And I think it's a great segue into this piece. I think one of the ways you might determine whether you want to financially support an organization is by pursuing the non-financial aspects first. Sometimes it's hard to know. I mean, there's resources online like GuideStar or Charity Navigator where you can explore whether a not-for-profit might be using your money reasonably. For example, if lots of it goes to administrative costs versus program costs, it may help you determine whether you want to make a donation to an organization. But that's not always exactly the right way to look through that opportunity. But one of the ways you can most intimately know an organization is by volunteering for them. So if you're not sure exactly how much impact you want to make, get to know the organization, volunteer on their behalf, educate yourself, right? So know the staff, understand, how they prioritize their programming. So all those different aspects of kind of the non-financial ways of being involved as well kind of helps lead down the path of, all right, well then financially, how can I support them? How much can I afford to support them? And then ultimately, what tools are going to be available for me to make gifts? But there's lots of different ways on a non-financial side that can help, I think, provide more information to lead people to making a much more financial impact than anything else. So the aspect of gifting now versus gifting later can be motivated both by desire and passion, but it also could be motivated by income or estate tax considerations. And then, of course, you can probably see this from the nonprofit's point of view as well. Most nonprofits appreciate the opportunity to have a gift come to them now, but they also appreciate the opportunity to receive gifts later. So in the next series of slides, Joel and I will kind of talk through the aspects of giving financially now with different tax tools that are available, but also kind of incorporating it into an estate plan. And I think if you were interested or motivated to make a more substantial or larger gift as part of a philanthropic plan that Joel's going to talk through a little bit later, you might find that working with an individual nonprofit and asking them when they would ultimately prefer to receive gifts can also be part of that gift planning process. But of course, as you can imagine, gifting now certainly helps you with your income taxes today. It can help you lower maybe the overall value of your estate today as well. I also think giving now helps you understand how that charity will use your money. So just as I was mentioning before about using your time to make a charitable gift and having that be a source of information before you actually write the check, giving now can also help you understand how the money is used, which may inform you on whether you want to make a larger gift now versus a larger gift later. So now versus later, obviously it has more the impact relative to the priorities and things that are important to you. But kind of thinking about, giving now, Joel, I know you've got lots of thoughts on the different vehicles that we can utilize and obviously the tax benefits of doing so. So certainly want, you to chime in here and help give us some more context on these items.
Thanks, Jake. And this is definitely where we're gonna get dense. So I know Jake's gonna kind of bring me in here, some break here, spell me. We don't want you guys to get overwhelmed. But we are financial advisors, and we are going to think about these from a unique lens, and so hopefully that's going to come through to help you think more intelligently about your giving. As Jake was referring to, giving now, giving later. One of the things we think about as financial advisors is, all right, a gift that is going to be made at death is going to certainly be of charitable benefit to an organization. A gift that is going to be made in life can have substantial tax savings in addition. So you're in essence creating more money for your heirs than you would have had you just given to the charity at your death, right? So we definitely want to think actively about, are there gifts that we can be making in life that not are just going to be having the charitable intent, but are also going to save us on taxes? Because the United States tax code allows for many ways of saving money on giving. One caveat I always give here when I talk with people is, let's not give purely for tax savings. It's not going to work. Right? Whenever you give, you're giving a certain amount of money from you. It's just that because you get a tax benefit, the government is in essence paying for part of it. But still, it's money out of your pocket. So if somebody comes to me and says, how can I save money by giving? I say, no, we're not going to save money overall by giving. We're going to leverage, what we're able to give, because in essence, we get a tax savings, okay? But we have to already be inclined to give. So at that point, if that's the assumption we're going to have, all right, we're already inclined to give. We're thinking, do we give now or later? What are the tools we can use to give now? There's a multitude. I'm going to cover most of these here. And we'll probably start from least complex and go more into more and more complex. We'll ease you guys into this. The first tool we'll talk about, clearly you can give cash, right? Clearly, as Jake said, you can give time. if we're going to try and save additional money from what we could have given with a cash gift, we're going to look to, well, are there appreciated assets? All right. And appreciated assets means it's something you purchased years ago that is now worth more than it was at the time that you purchased it. We're not talking about inside an IRA. We're not talking a Roth IRA, retirement plan. Those all have different tax rules. I'm talking about something you bought out of your pocket and it's grown. It could be a mutual fund. It could be a stock. It could be a bond. It could be a house. It could be a violin. It could be a piece of art. There's any number of things that can be appreciated, and there's ways of giving appreciated assets to charity. What's the benefit of doing that? Well, the issue you encounter when you're trying to sell anything that you hold that is appreciated is you're going to owe taxes. You're going to owe a capital gains tax on that sale. You don't owe taxes on the purchase price. It's whatever the growth has been of that asset. At the point of sale, you'll pay income taxes to your state. Most states consider, if they tax income, they'll consider that capital gain just regular income. The federal government gives you a little bit of a break there. They have a special long-term capital gains rate if you've held for more than a year, but you're still going to pay at least 15% tax in all likelihood on that gain. However, if you give directly to charity, you get to avoid that capital gain. So you get a benefit on your taxes because you gave charitably, right? If you are itemizing your deductions, and you avoided a capital gains tax. So we call that double dipping on our tax benefits, right? So let's say that I own, $50,000 worth of company ABC. I only bought it for $5,000. If I were to sell it, I'd owe taxes on $45,000 of gain. However, if I decide to give it away, I wipe that tax away. Now, some people would ask at that point, well, wait, am I passing off a tax to the charity? The answer is no. Charity's not going to pay tax on that. They could do a number of things with that asset. They could decide to hold it as part of a portfolio. They could decide to just sell it immediately and take the cash and use it towards their needs, but they are not going to pay that tax. That is a tax that has been washed away from the fact that you gave an appreciated asset. All right. So I try and think about especially the assets that have been held for the longest, that are the most gain, that will be most beneficial for this strategy. And I've even had people say to me, well, wait a second. My most appreciated asset is my Apple stock, and I love Apple stock. I'm not ever going to do anything with that. And my answer to them is, great, keep on holding the Apple stock. I'm not making that advice, but keep on holding the Apple stock. My answer is this, though. If you were going to give $50,000 to charity, give $50,000 of appreciated Apple stock, put the $50,000 of cash that you were going to give the charity into your portfolio, and buy the Apple stock right back. So you have not eliminated the holding from your portfolio. All you did was you gave a better asset and you raised your cost basis of the security that you hold in your portfolio so that if you were to sell it later on, you'd owe less taxes. All right. So donating appreciated assets can be hugely valuable.
Just the one thing I'll jump in and comment on here, Joel, is that occasionally, now it depends on the size of the nonprofit, right? If you're giving to St. Jude, for example, they'll be very familiar with taking in appreciated stock in this example. So if you wanted to make a transfer, they're a large enough entity where they have a brokerage account that can ultimately receive the stock to help process this contribution. But if you're working with a much smaller, more localized not-for-profit, it's possible they don't have a brokerage account to actually receive a donation of appreciated securities like this. So you have to think about that a little bit in advance, and quite frankly, probably communicate with the nonprofit just to make sure that they're established enough to be able to help you with this kind of transaction if you wanted to move in this way.
I agree wholeheartedly. The one thing that I'd add there is just don't assume. You may think that the charity is too small and, oh, this is just my local church and they're not going to have. You would be surprised at the number of entities that have created a brokerage account. And if you are intending to give a gift of a certain amount, you'd be surprised at the number of charities that would say, well, we can open a brokerage account to receive that. We'd be happy to do that. So yes, work with the department. This is one of those places you want to communicate. You want to be an active giver and talk about ways that are going to save you money and save the charity, as well. So it's going to be great to talk. All right.
Yeah, you're right, Joel. I think most nonprofits probably have what's called a gift acceptance policy, something within, their endowment funds that identifies how they will ultimately receive donations. And most of the time, appreciated assets are listed there. But right. Yeah, communicate.
That's right. So, yeah, what we're doing is we're giving directly to the charity. We're not selling the security. Importantly, right? Can't sell the security. If I do and then I give the cash, I'm realizing that gain. I can't avoid it at that point. All right. And the deduction amount that you're going to get is whatever the fair market value of the security was as of the date that you gave it. So there are people who have given a house to a charity, right? If they're going to do that, and the charity's complex enough that it can handle it, some will want that. All you'll need to do is get an appraisal of that property before you give it, so that you have evidence of what the fair market value was as of the date of gift. Now, you are limited in any charitable giving. If you want to give appreciated securities, it can only be up to 30% of your adjusted gross income for the year of the gift. If you were going to give in cash, it would have been 60%. So we want to work carefully with a tax advisor when we're doing this, so that it's not that you'd lose it. You'd be able to use some of the additional charitable gift in future years. You'd have a charitable carry forward. But let's say that you have a really big tax year, right? And you're thinking of making a very large gift and to save money in this year. That's going to involve some more sophisticated advice to make sure that you're doing it in the right way to maximize the benefit in the current year that is your high income year. So that brings us, kind of transitions us to another little more complex way of giving, very valuable and especially valuable to someone who is looking at selling a business or receiving an unusually high amount of income, a huge bonus in a single year that is unexpected to continue, right? And that would be a donor advised fund. Now, the concept of a donor advised fund, I have to back you up a little bit first to say that we can bunch giving. All right. The idea behind bunching giving is that, hey, I can, and Jake, maybe we'll go forward here to just show what we can do here. So if I'm, especially in today's environment where the standard deduction is quite high, I can end up in a scenario where my state and property taxes are capped at $10,000. That's the SALT deduction, right? My mortgage interest isn't that high anymore because I'm close to retirement. And my medical expenses don't exceed 7.5% of my income. So I have to give a significant amount of charity just to reach up to the line that we show here of the standard deduction, so that my charitable deductions start helping me. All right. However, I can bunch. I can give 1 year, the 2 years of giving in 1 year, and the next slide will show that. I can give 2 years or 3 years or 4 years of charitable deductions in a single tax year, and it moves all of those future year charitable deductions into the current year, so that they've all become valuable. I'll still get to be able to use the standard deduction in future years, so my future year's taxes are unaffected, but my present year's tax is substantially affected. So at its most basic, I just talk to people about, well, the giving that you normally do in December, give in January, and then give your regular gifting in December of that year. And you've now bunched charitable donations 2 years worth into one tax year, and maybe that's going to help you tax-wise. The donor advised fund is just taking that concept and putting it on steroids. A donor advised fund, think of it as a large parking lot for your charitable giving. You are not giving directly to a charity right now. You're giving it to a fund account that you will then use in the future to give to charity. And I know that that gets a little confusing, so let me say it one more time. You're not giving to charity directly right now. You're giving money into a fund that in the future you're going to use to give to charity. All right. These donor advised funds have been set up by Schwab has one, Fidelity has one. There's a group called American Endowment Foundation that can take some more complex gifts. But these are technically charities. They are nonprofits that have been set up by these institutions. So you are getting a charitable deduction for the year that you put the money into the account. You will not get an additional charitable deduction in the future when you give money from the account. You're getting the whole deduction now. The value to you is if you are in a very high income year, you can supersize your giving into that donor advised fund so that all your charitable gifts move into a single tax year, say for the next 5, 10, 20 years of giving. I've seen people use this as well if they're thinking of doing Roth conversions, where they're thinking of moving money from a traditional IRA over into a Roth IRA. That's a hugely taxable event, and they already have charitable intent. So they pair that with a very large contribution into a donor advised fund to reduce the tax bill and get money over into the Roth account. So again, what we're talking about here is we're talking about taking charitable giving you were already intending to do and utilizing it in its best way for you from a tax perspective, right? So that's what the donor advised fund is great. It's kind of the idea of what used to be foundations, right? You could open a family foundation. Well, that's going to need its own tax return. It's going to need an administrative paperwork. A lawyer is going to have to set it up. You're going to have a required giving amount from it each year. You have to have a purpose for what you're giving for. The donor advised fund throws all that out. You don't have to do any of that. You give the money into the fund. You decide whatever charity you want to give to. And if you don't want to give to any charity in a given year, you don't have to. And if you look behind the scenes at one of the things this is allowed to be done for charitable giving, what makes it more powerful actually than a foundation is that when a foundation has a 5% annual giving requirement, it can never go above 60% stock really in its allocation because it needs to make gifts each year, just like an individual who's retiring needs to have some defensiveness in their portfolio. Well, a donor advised fund, if you want to leave it all invested in stock and only give in years where the market is up, you can end up with a huge amount more to give to charity someday because you've got an all stock allocation inside there with no required giving amount. Now, if I flip this over, we have to give equal time to everybody here, right? Charities are not necessarily thrilled with money sitting in a donor advised fund forever. There's money accumulated in there. People thought, hey, I don't know who I want to give to, but I'll give money into there and someday. So Jake and I are really being careful to recommend here, you do this strategically. You have a strategy for how you're going to give. You're not going to park that money and just leave it alone for years and years. It will be part of a strategy for giving. But I've seen people use this as a great family vehicle for giving. So what's the concept there? The idea is parents or grandparents take a large amount, put it into the donor advised fund, and then have a family meeting each year to talk about what charities do we want to give to this year. They can all come with ideas and vote on the best idea. They can all come with ideas and have a certain amount go to every charity that has been discussed. But what's great about that, number one, it encourages the family to get together, which is, who loses there. Number two, it gets the family to think about giving, which is generally what parents and grandparents want to inspire in some way of giving back, right? And number three, it gets the family talking about investments in a safe sandbox. You've put money into the donor advised fund. It doesn't have all your net worth. It has a small portion of your net worth. But you can talk about how markets did that year. Was the donor advised fund up? Was it down? Wow, it's up that much? Oh, that's amazing. You're in a safe sandbox where you don't have to reveal your entire net worth, but you can talk about investment conversations in a safe space.
Those are great points. I think there's one little nuanced risk. It's very nuanced because it doesn't happen frequently, but I've seen it before. Since it's called a donor advised fund, technically it's no longer your money. So let's say you choose Charles Schwab as the entity or Schwab Charitable to form this new donor advised fund, and you make this large $50,000 contribution from Apple stock in your example, Joel, and it goes into this account, which is now established as the so-and-so's family charitable giving fund. Well, if you want to make a gift from that fund, you have to go through Schwab's portal to ultimately transact the gift to St. Jude in the example I used before. But if you choose a charity that is not on their platform, or if you choose a charity that may be relatively obscure, Schwab has the authority to deny the gift, right? You advise on that gift, but they have the authority to say no. Now, this doesn't happen very frequently. And for the most part, every mostly regulated 501c3 with a tax ID number, with an address, with an actual, bylaws, and they file a tax return of 990 every year for their organization, it's not going to happen. And if you don't have it on the list with Charles Schwab, you could recommend that the new nonprofit gets added to the list. But it is a risk. Right. Whereas in family foundations, even though there's quite a bit more complexity, there's less risk of that occurring because you are the ultimate control of where the money goes with your family board in that example.
That's right. Absolutely. I think, again, this comes back to communicating, right? Communicate in advance with the charities that you're looking at giving to, finding out if they are on the platform. And then, if they're not, communicating with Schwab and saying, hey, what about this is not working that we could not give to this? Because sometimes that can be ironed out. But a very good point that it's not technically your money anymore. And importantly also, it does not come out of the fund except to charity. This is not something where you put money in temporarily, you can take it back into your control. This has moved outside of your control. It's permanently in that hands. And I'll also say that there is a fee that the institution charges on the assets inside the fund because it is quite expensive for them to run. All right, it is a charity and it does have costs. So these are all things to think about, but wow, donor advised fund, hugely powerful gift, especially in situations where you have an unusually high tax year and you're trying to get money out of it and you already have charitable intent. Okay, so let's talk about one that's much more tangible and much more used by just about everybody I talk to who's over 70 and a half, if I can just explain it to them. All right, and this is, we're talking about the qualified charitable distribution. Now, you are allowed every year to give up to $100,000 from your IRA if you are over 70 and a half. And now you're like, well, wait a second, I thought the required distribution age moved to 72 and 73 actually. Yeah, they just try and keep financial advisors and accountants in business, I'm convinced. Because when they changed the tax law, they didn't change the law on the QCD. Somebody missed that page. So you can still, starting at 70 and a half, and it has to be 70 and a half. You cannot make this, it's not the year you turn 70 and a half, you have to have turned 70 and a half. You can then give money from your charity, from your IRA directly to a charity, up to $100,000. Now, this can be hugely beneficial if you have reached the point that you are not itemizing deductions anymore. Because like I said before, if you're not itemizing, and check with your accountant. Because I've had people talk to me and say, no, I am itemizing. I give my charitable deductions every year to my accountant. I say, yeah, look at your Schedule A. Because it's very possible your accountant is faithfully entering all those numbers into the charitable column, but you're still only using the standard deduction. Very important thing to check when you get off the phone today. But I would say if you're not getting the itemized deduction benefit, or even if you're only getting a little bit, let's say that you've given, $20,000 and only $5,000 of it is effective in saving you tax because the first $15,000 is just getting you up over that standard deduction hurdle. If you give from the IRA, it's effective from $1. The money never enters into your income. Every dollar of it you gave, you just avoided income tax. So if you have charitable intent and you have a very large IRA, this is something that you want to consider doing. Now, there's an added benefit to it once you get to 73 and you have a required distribution. And that benefit is it counts toward your required minimum distribution. If I have to take $50,000 out of my IRA and I give $20,000 to charity from my IRA, I only have to take out another $30,000. That just turned into what we call an above the line deduction. You just had income that you were required to recognize that you took down before you even had to calculate tax or deductions or anything. Very valuable. Again, only if you already have charitable intent. But my goodness, if you're not planning on spending all the money that comes through your required distribution, then and you have charitable intent, this is a no-brainer. It saves you dollars from day one.
Joel, what about the folks that ask the question about trying to get sneaky and say, hey, can I take money out of my IRA in this situation and send it to my donor advised fund?
That's a very important question to answer. You cannot do that. This is, you can, oh, well, great, I'll just park it. I'm not going to give it. Remember, we're talking about giving strategy here. You have to make the gift in the year of. You cannot put this into a donor advised fund. The other thing that I will bring up, and it is in red here, and the red is very important. The tax forms have not been adjusted for these qualified charitable distributions. So you will receive a document at tax time indicating that you took money out of your IRA, and you have to keep a record that you gave that money to charity. If you're in TurboTax, H&R Block software, whatever, they will ask you at some point, did you make a qualified charitable distribution? And if you're kind of clicking yes, no, kind of blowing through, you could miss that. And that's important to say, no, I got to make sure that I've noted I gave a qualified charitable distribution so that you avoid the income tax. It won't be on the tax form.
That's a great point. Well, I'd say let's amp up the complexity here a little bit, should we?
Let's as they say, kick it up a notch, right?
Yeah.
All right. This is, and we will stop here. We won't get more complex than here. There's some other things you could do, but let's wrap things up talking about charitable lead annuity trust. All right. There are ways of giving to charity via trusts. All right. They're irrevocable trusts. When you set them up, you're putting money into the trust There's two ways of doing it. It's either called a lead trust or a remainder trust. But let me outline in full the lead trust. The concept is you and your spouse put $500,000 into a trust. There is a 5% giving requirement. Sound familiar? Just like a family foundation. 5% giving requirement from the trust every year, and you've already predetermined the charity that's going to get that money. Okay? So the charity receives $25,000 per year. After the trust period ends, typically 20 years, the remainder in that trust goes to whoever you've designated as the beneficiaries of that trust. And it goes to them estate tax free. It's not technically a gift. You did not technically give money. You didn't use up any of your lifetime gifting exemption. You have given that money in another way to beneficiaries in a roundabout manner. Okay. So why would you do this? Well, the year that you put the money into the trust, you get a very large tax deduction, a charitable contribution deduction. I will not say that it's the full $500,000 because it's the net present value of all the gifts that you're going to give to the charity. So it's going to be something somewhat less. However, what it's going to do is set up a set amount to go to that charity over a long period of years, so you just don't even think about it anymore. And it gives you the power so that if you invest the funds well inside that trust, there will be a remaining amount to go to whoever your beneficiaries that you stated are. All right. Let me give you a very practical reason why you would use this. And it's that if you are, I will just use colleges because, man, they've got huge planned giving groups, don't they? Let's say that your alma mater has reached out to you and said, hey, we'd like some money. One thing you can know is if you've given to an organization like that once, you're going to get a phone call every year, if not every month, right? Because now you are on their list of people who have given, and they're going to reach back out to you, as they should, because they're trying to raise money for their organization. But it can get a little bit cumbersome. Well, here's a way of working through that. You say, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to set up this trust. It's going to pay $25,000 per year to you, and that's how we are doing this. And that's now going to handle that conversation the rest of the way. Just point to, hey, charitable lead trust. We set it up, remember? All right. So this is a good way of kind of institutionalizing a kind of gift that you really do want to have happening every year, but you don't want to think every year about, oh dear, what am I going to give this year, right? And you get a nice big charitable deduction in the current year. So again, very valuable if you expect your income tax this year to be much more than it's going to be in a future year. How'd I do there, Jake? We're pretty complex, but.
Pretty complex. I'm going to throw a few little things in there. One, to add more complexity, but two, kind of aligned with what we talked about before. So on the second point, remember when I said earlier in the call that giving to charity now helps inform you of whether you'd like to make a more substantial gift later? Now, you don't have to be as sophisticated or quite as large as a charitable lead annuity trust. It could be like a donor advised fund as an example as well. But any of these tools are just ways to give money to a specific charity that if you decide, and if, again, financially you are okay, you have enough that you can have in that aspirational bucket to even lead a more substantial gift to charity if it was important to you. And here's a great example of, okay, we'll give them $25,000 a year in this example. And boy, if I feel so compelled that they did a great job, for the money that we entrusted to them over the 20-year period of time, well, perhaps we want to leave them a more substantial gift at death as well, because we've already transferred estate tax-free a substantial amount of assets to our kids, in this example, right? But on the first point before, this is where, Joel, financial planning is a little bit tricky and funny. And of course, the IRS writes the rules and we just have to try to work within them. But before, when I'd ask you the question about whether qualified distributions for charity out of IRAs can go to a donor advised fund, and you said no, and that was correct, obviously. Well, a charitable lead annuity trust, that $25,000 a year, guess what? That can go to a donor advised fund. So not only can you set up this trust, benefit your family on estate tax free later on, but all those payments that go to charity, you can actually name that to be your donor advised fund, and you can continue to punt on the decision to give to charity in a large way, in a small way, over a period of time, or however you ultimately structure it. But there's lots of little ways within the rules to kind of work these things, not only to your advantage from a philanthropic giving perspective, but also thinking about it best from an income and an estate tax perspective as well.
Hugely important, Jake. Very good to bring up. Thank you. So kind of to wrap up here, we've gone from simple to complex. There's a number of ways that you can give charitably that are going to positively impact your taxes. The last point I'll just bring up is we've kept everything focused on income taxes so far. We've kind of mentioned casually. I'm going to mention it specifically. Up until December 31 of this year, you can give $13.6 million each to whoever you want. As of January 1 of next year, it's a little over $14 million each, and be completely free of estate tax. However, there are going to be people on this call who are above that threshold. If you are above that threshold, giving during life is going to save you three ways. It's going to save you income taxes in current year. It could save you capital gains taxes, and it can save you estate taxes. So we get a trifecta there. Like we don't get any better than that. So keep in mind, if you are at the levels where you have a substantial amount of assets, do not just build the charities into your estate plan, right? And you can be concerned at that point about, well, oh, wait a second, how is this all going to play around then? Because what if I give to charities during life, but I had it written in my estate plan? We can work through that, right? Someone can help you work through that, whether that's your attorney, your accountant, your financial advisor. However, you do not want to leave assets that are going to go to charity at death if you were going to be subject to estate tax in a way that you are not going to save income tax during life, because you're generally in a very high tax bracket. We can save a lot of money on income taxes as well.
It's a great segue because there's a few elements of tax provision which have been discussed, but also tax provision which are legislated to happen. Maybe a little less certainty that the potential changes in tax law would otherwise go back to what the rules were in 2016 in our current law, which is set to sunset at the end of 2025. With kind of a Republican sweep in Congress and in the presidential election, there's a possibility that existing estate tax and income tax law just gets extended. But we wanted to at least comment on a couple of items here as it relates to your estate. Now, we've talked about these questions to consider about, all right, making sure your estate plans align from a charitable giving perspective. But really think about these two questions. And most importantly, Joel and I, the other advisors would remind you that an estate plan, whether it's a will, a trust, whether it's these more sophisticated charitable trusts, these are things that need to be reviewed regularly. Not just to figure out, of course, when the timing of monies will be transferred to others, either during life or at death, but making sure it kind of accurately reflects what you want. So these questions to kind of consider from an estate planning perspective surround, income and potential estate tax considerations. So Joel, what you were mentioning before about estate tax exemptions on a per person level federally, being 14 million each at this point in time. Well, until we know differently in 2026, those are being halved. So those will go from 14 million approximately down to about 7 million in 2026. So with a decreased estate exemption, might otherwise make you more willing or more interested in larger family transfers or perhaps charitable transfers as well to take advantage of some of those considerations. Also, we know as part of the existing tax law, which will expire, there will be higher marginal income tax rates and potentially capped deductions. So if you were willing to make larger gifts to charity, one of the things that was part of potential legislation a couple of years ago were the element of capped deductions, maximum capital gain rate on very large sources of income, and elimination of what, Joel, you were talking about, that eliminated cost basis step up. So what do I mean by this? Well, very briefly, capped deductions, there was some consideration around if you wanted to make large gifts to charity, that those gifts to charity would only offset into the 28% tax bracket. So if you were in a much higher tax bracket, like 33, 35, or even up to 40%, you actually wouldn't get the deduction on those higher rates. You would only be limited to the full 28% bracket. So it might mean, making more substantial gifts to charity in the next couple of tax years, or perhaps if some other legislation could change. But along with that, capital gains being an important part of, most people's financial plan because they've built wealth outside of retirement accounts. You have situations where if you have very large appreciated assets and you might ultimately die with those assets, the cost basis at death right now gets stepped up to the market value of the date of someone's passing. So in Joel, in your example before, you had a $50,000 stock position that you paid $5,000 for. At death, right now, that $5,000 of cost basis gets stepped up to market value at the date of death, which means income tax-free passage of assets to family members. Well, if cost basis at some point gets eliminated or there's some kind of exemption, maybe not as likely now as maybe it was a couple of years ago, that could influence folks to give more to charity, perhaps before death, or consider ways to exit out of positions of high appreciated positions. They may be held for a long period of time, because all these different elements can always change. So now we have a new 4-year cycle, likely from a overall Congress and presidential perspective. And after that, it'll be another 4-year cycle and another 4-year cycle. So these are things as advisors that we're always keeping our eye on behalf of individuals and families we work with, because we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of the more strategic and procedural side, along with making sure helping folks understand their priorities as well. So Joel, kind of considering this in a wrapped up way, right? When we think about someone's personalized philanthropic plan, just give us your quick spiel here on overall planning.
I love this slide. I mean, this summarizes pretty much everything that we talked about. So I think what we're talking about here, to sum up, we don't want you to just think randomly, oh, should I give on December 1st each year? We want you to think more strategically about, what is my tax situation? What are going to be my high income tax years? Do I stand to owe estate tax potentially at death? When do I want my charities to receive money? How much do I want to give to my children? We're talking about all the interplays of factors, right? And as Jake said here at the end, it's not a passive activity. It's not a set it and forget it. The idea is things change over time, so we'll need to evolve it. But at least as of today, it would be good to settle on, hey, who would I like to give to when? Do I want to give a death and life? How do I save the most in taxes? How do I allocate my dollars? What kind of methodology do I want to use on my planned giving? How do I engage my heirs or my children? We talked about that. Do I want them involved in this charitable process? Then how do I document everything so that if somebody else looks at this someday and I'm incapacitated, they know what I was thinking, right? And then we build that all as part of an integrated financial plan. And I'm just going to throw one freebie in here because y'all stayed till the end, all right? One extra thought about in your planned giving, and this is only going to be effective at death, so that's why it doesn't fit in with all the other income tax ideas. But if you have taxable accounts and you have IRAs, to the point that Jay just made, anything right now, at least according to current tax law, anything sitting in one of those taxable brokerage accounts is going to get a full step up in basis. It's excellent to give to your children. Anything sitting in one of those IRAs is the least tax effective investment that you can pass on to the next generation, because they're going to have to take the entire IRA balance out that they inherit within 10 years. That's all they get. So you get a lifetime, they get 10 years. As a result, when you're building that estate portion of your planned giving, build the charitable part into the IRA. And I'm not saying give the whole IRA to charity. It may be that it's only $200,000 or $100,000 of that IRA, because that's all you want to give from. But do not make a general statement in your will to give $100,000 to charity. Restrict it so that the $100,000 comes from that IRA, because that was going to be a really tax inefficient asset for your kids to receive. And the brokerage account is a very tax effective asset for them to receive, or your house for that matter, right? The stepped up basis on your personal residence. I think we covered a lot of ground here today.
We sure did. We sure did. Kind of in that light, right? When we think about all the unique things we talked about, which could be very personalized. If we didn't, get to questions or thoughts you were having as we went through this presentation, please go to the link at the bottom to schedule just a quick call with us. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have directly, learn more about your situation, and provide something that's a bit more personalized as opposed to broad brushstroke. But just wanted to mention that we do have some questions that came through that we have just a couple of minutes to answer. So wanted to answer some of these questions live. Let me just pull up the considerations here. So, this is one, Joe, we didn't answer. So what happens to funds left over in a donor advised fund after someone's death?
Oh, that's a great question. All right. Funds left over in a donor advised fund after your death. Two methods of handling it. All right. You have the option of naming a charity of last resort, in essence, that says if the owner or owners of this donor advised fund account are deceased, all funds go to this charity, right? The other way that you can do it is you can name a successor trustee of that fund, donor of that fund, who could probably be one of your children, a friend, a niece or nephew. You name them as the successor grantor of that donor advised fund, so they get to decide how they're going to give it. Either way is fine. but you want to have one of those options selected.
Yeah, the worst result, Joe, would be leaving it to Schwab Charitable or Fidelity Charitable for them to decide, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always say the worst decision you're going to make is better than the best decision they're going to make on your behalf. So
that's right. That's right. I've got time for just one more question here. So the last one that we have here is, am I limited to only gifting to one charity if I do a QCD? So I'll take this one. QCD, if you remember, is the qualified charitable distribution. So that's what Joel is referring to when you take distributions out of an IRA and it goes directly to charity and it qualifies as a deduction. Basically, it's your income, right? So you have less income that shows up on your tax return. And no, you're not limited to just one charity. Oftentimes, what families will do is they'll actually submit a list and say, all right, these are the 15 to 20 charities that I'd like to make gifts to from my IRA. These are the addresses for where those gifts should be sent. And this is the amount for each one of the checks. And it's a simple form, a form that otherwise gets submitted to the custodian of the assets, whether it's Schwab or Fidelity or Vanguard or other major custodians from that perspective. And then they make the gifts directly to the institutions on your behalf. So it saves you a little bit of postage, a little bit of time. The one downside to this is, say, for example, you attend a church, right? And you go every week. It used to be that everyone passed around the basket to make contributions for every week you're in church. Well, if you have a little bit of guilt because you didn't otherwise make your contribution to the basket that particular week because you made one large transfer from your IRA, you have to balance whether you gift from your IRA versus gift in person. And again, it comes down to personal priorities there. But by no means are you limited to the number of charities. You're only limited to the dollar amount, which for 2024 is actually limited to $105,000 per person per IRA. So, which is also indexed to inflation.
And I'll add to that, Jake, that again, communication, because some of those charities don't want to get that check outright. Some of those charities want to get that check from you. So you can instruct the custodian to either have the check sent to you that you forward to the charity, or it goes to the charity directly itself. And check with your individual 501c3 charity that you want to give to and find out how they prefer best.
Yep, exactly right. Yeah, communication is key, like with everything in life.
That's right.
It was a joy to be able to present today's webinar. And if you have more questions or information you'd like to know about Savant, please feel free to go to our website, savantwealth.com, and we'll look forward to connecting with you there. Thanks again, and have a great day. Thanks, Joel.
Take care, all.
If you enjoyed this webinar, visit savantwealth.com/guides and download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources.